the Lord thy God hath delivered them into thine hands, and thou hast taken them captive, and seest among them captives a beautiful woman, and hast a desire unto her, then thou wouldest have her to be thy wife. Then thou shalt bring her home to thine house, and she shall shape her head and pare her nails. If you go to war and you see a beautiful woman, according to Deuteronomy, you can rape that woman, but she has to become your wife afterwards. If we ask here about rape and punishment, also from Deuteronomy, it states, if a man happens to meet in a town a virgin, pledged to be married, and he sleeps with her, you shall take them both to the gate of that town and stone them to death. The young woman, because she was in a town and did not scream for help, and the man, because he violated another man's wife. What I would like to point out with that is not a critique of the Bible, but to understand something about the origins of our own religious traditions when it comes to morality, and how things that were once generally accepted when it came to Western civilization have now come to be rejected, for the most part, in the modern era. One of the things we need to understand about how women experience war differently from men, particularly when that war is going on in their own backyards. When men leave, whether it be a husband, a father, or a son, is it changes the social structure of that society. Women who may have traditionally relied upon men for protection within that patriarchal social order no longer have that protection. What's also important to understand is how women are displaced by conflict, particularly when conflict gets to urban centers. If men are off fighting that war, women are left in the ruins of trying to survive and to take care of that family during the war, particularly when there's a collapse in moral order when it comes to the phenomenon of war. When we talk about casualties of war, though, when we talk about war from a men's perspective, we almost exclusively talk about physical or emotional casualties when it comes to things like PTSD or the death of a soldier. Women experience war very differently. Number one, we'll talk about this more with the Japanese comfort women, is women being utilized as, quote, a comfort role for soldiers. In other words, a military instituted policy of systematic rape. What we also need to understand here is women being utilized as sex slaves when it comes to armed forces. One of the ways of keeping your morale up for your male soldiers is to allow them to participate in a number of things that many of us would find to be morally reprehensible. One of the other things we need to keep in mind here, particularly when we get to the 20th century and talk about the phenomenon of both Germany and also of Yugoslavia, is that if you want to displace populations, one of the easiest ways of doing that is to target the women of that population, to make things so uncomfortable and dangerous for them that they want to leave their homeland so others can occupy it and take it over. One of the things we need to understand about that when it comes to warfare is talking about the phenomenon of public rape, where militaries have chosen intentionally in very public settings to rape women in front of an audience as a message to that community. It's time to pack up and leave and go someplace else. The other people now want to take that over, essentially trying to instigate a process of self-deportation. One of the most notorious examples of that is going to be in 1945, at the end of World War II, with the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe. One of the goals that the Soviets had when they occupied Eastern Europe was to force Germans out of Eastern Europe. What the Soviet Union chose to do in this situation, though, for the first 2 years of occupation, as I just got done saying in one of my classes, just because somebody has committed war crimes against you does not give you the right to commit war crimes back. This is a study that was done about Soviet occupation just a couple of years ago by a British journalist who wrote, in Berlin alone, it was estimated that up to 130,000 women were raped, of whom up to 10,000 committed suicide. Altogether, 2 million German women are believed to have been raped, and almost half of those suffered gang rape. One woman was raped by 23 soldiers. He said the widespread sexuality suggested, quote, there is a dark area of male sexuality which can emerge all too easily, especially in war, when there are no social or disciplinary restraints. The Red Army example shows the practice of collective rape can become a form of bonding process. I was shaken to the core when I discovered that soldiers rape female prisoners of war in an alcohol-induced frenzy of sadism and humiliation. Those were stories I wasn't even aware of. One of the great tragedies if you study about the Holocaust. The death camps were primarily located in Poland, and the Red Army was the primary force that liberated the death camps. And what became very common was many of those women were already walking skeletons. And the Red Army raped women who had already survived the tortures and the horrors of the death camps. Now here's the great question of the 20th century and the modern time. Can and should war be regulated? By the very nature of war, what we're talking about here is the destruction of civilizations and the mass murder of human beings. Should there be rules to conflict? It's one of the great questions that plagued the 20th century. Radhika Kuzmari, who is one of the heads of the United Nations, Assistant General Secretary right now, said, although rape is one of the most widely used types of violation against women and girls, it remains the least condemned war crime. What we often talk about here is we talk about the death of soldiers, we talk about genocide, we talk about the physical destruction of cities, but we don't talk about the experience, particularly that women and young women who are children experience when it comes to war. One of the things to understand about the 20th century, particularly after the phenomenon of the Industrial Revolution, what the Industrial Revolution brought humanity is it brought some very positive things with consumer society, but what it also brought was a very negative aspect of new weapons of war. What's important to understand, 1907 at the Hague Convention, this is the first time international leaders got together to ask the question, if an industrial power went to war with another industrial power, should there be rules of conduct that follow here? One of the things to understand about this is they never talk about the phenomenon of rape. And particularly, they never talk about any aspects of attacking women or attacking children. Sex crimes were inferred in some of the language, but never directly addressed. One of the things to understand then is the taboo-ness that came out of sexuality coming with the 19th century. If you study what's called the Victorian period of the 19th century, sex and sexuality was something that was not to be discussed in public, was not something to be addressed, very, very irrational levels sometimes. If you weren't aware of this in 1917, those of you who are in History 1700 had heard this story before. In 1917, there was actually 45 people in Great Britain who were arrested for treason and put in prison during the British war effort of World War I because they'd been giving productions of Oscar Wilde plays. What the British government argued in 1917 was a tabloid scandal that was referred to at the time as the cult of the clitoris. As they argued, since Oscar Wilde, despite the fact that he'd been dead since 1905, had been a flamboyant homosexual. And the British women, since they were watching Oscar Wilde plays, were becoming lesbians. That Oscar Wilde was reaching out from beyond the grave and turning young British women queer. And therefore, young British men were not getting, quote, the services and comfort that they needed during wartime. And they actually put people in prison for this. It's very foreign to our modern mind, but it's something to understand about the mindset still of the early 20th century. In 1929, after witnessing the horrors of World War I, international leaders came together at the very first Geneva Convention. What the first Geneva Convention did is it talked about treatment of prisoners, it talked about the care of wounded enemies, but once again, it did little to nothing to address the aspects of civilians caught up in conflicts. One of the things to understand then about the 20th century, particularly when you talk about Nazi Germany, because Nazi Germany in the public mind is going to define war crimes for the 20th century. When Nazi Germany occupied the Soviet Union, what most Americans don't think about or don't realize is the Soviet Union lost 30 million people in that war. And it wasn't just Jews who were targeted for genocide by the Nazi regime, but common Slavic people as well. And what the Russians experienced under Nazi occupation is they quite literally burnt down 1/3 of their country to stop Nazi forces and lost 30 million people. And this is what Russians dealt with under Nazi occupation. One of the most dangerous things that happened in the year 1944 as the Nazis were being defeated by the Russian Red Army was women being caught as spies for the Russians who had been spying on the Nazis during occupation. There's testimony here from a Nazi war criminal. This is an interview that was conducted in the year 1998. where he stated openly to the interviewer, he said, "We beat her on the tits with a stick, clobbered her on the ass with a pistol, then all 8 of us raped her. Then we threw her outside and shot at her. And as she lay there, we threw grenades at her. Every time one of them landed near her body, she screamed." One of the problems that defining human rights and war crimes is when you talk about World War II, World War II is what we would call a total war, where there was no lines between the front and between civilians, and where all sides engaged in atrocities and had attitudes of trying to destroy the other side. One of the most revealing things that Adolf Hitler wrote, and he wrote this in the year 1924 in his book Mein Kampf, as he stated, "We shall not capitulate, no never. We may be destroyed, but if we are, we shall drag a world down with us, a world in flames." And sure enough, 20 years later, when it was obvious that Nazi Germany was going to lose that war, that's when Hitler ramped up the Holocaust and started intentionally targeting more civilians, because he had promised the world 20 years earlier that he'd drag the world down in flames with him. I'm going to mess up the pronunciation on this, sorry, I'm horrible at Asian pronunciations. There's a quote here from a Japanese leader talking about when the Americans first started getting close to Japan. He blatantly said, "Hell is upon us," because he knew this is what the Japanese were about to experience in their own homeland. A quote here from Admiral U.L.C, who had been stationed in the Pacific, saying, "Before we're through with them, the Japanese language will be spoken only in hell." This is the attitude of leaders on all sides when it comes to World War II, is the ultimate destruction of the enemy. One of the problems to understand when it comes down to war crimes after this war, one of the most famous legal cases that's ever going to happen is what's referred to as the Nuremberg war crimes trials, where we're going to take the 24 top leaders of Nazi Germany and put them on trial for crimes against humanity. One of the problems when it comes down to setting this agenda is the question, what does it mean when the victor gets to set the agenda and be in charge of the prosecution? And some of the things to understand when it comes down to World War II, well, the Nazis were the most notorious when it came to World War II for the targeting of civilians. The Allied forces weren't innocent of that as well. If you've ever heard about the firebombing of Dresden in February of 1945, historians approximate anywhere, some people say low numbers of 50,000, some people say 500,000, killed in one bombing raid, when Nazi Germany was already on the point of collapse. When you talk about the use of napalm, napalm was developed in 1944, but they hadn't had a chance to use it yet. If you ask a famous historian by the name of Lieutenant Howard Zinn about the bombing run he was sent in Royan, France in the first week of April 1945, where he was responsible for the death of 6,000 civilians because napalm hadn't been tested yet. When it comes down to the Soviet Union, for the fact that the Soviet Union lost 30 million of their own people, and a quarter of their nation had been destroyed by this, the Soviets argued that there were no rules when it came to the Eastern Front. They used to use the very famous phrase, "The only good Nazi is a dead Nazi." And it's something to understand here when it came down to rape of women in Eastern Europe for the first 2 years of occupation. Red Army commanders said there were no rules when it came to engagement, whether it was with military forces or with civilians. What we also need to understand, though, is just because war crimes have been committed against you doesn't give you the excuse to commit war crimes back. One of the problems we're going to see here is the birth of the United Nations at the end of World War II. It's going to be a UN mandate that creates the Nuremberg war crimes trials. The question being, were the laws written at the time written to, quote, fit the crime of the Nazis and ignore crimes by other people? When it comes down to American concepts of justice and Soviet concepts of justice at the end of the war, the Americans believe in having a fair trial, very much based upon the American legal system. The Soviets believe in physical retaliation and revenge for the experience of World War II. One of the other great tragedies that we need to understand is the aspect of French women who had lived under Nazi occupation. One way of surviving a war and making sure that yourself is protected is to collaborate with the Nazis politically, but also sometimes physically. And one of the things that happened to many French women in 1945 and 1946, if you had had sexual relations with a German during that war, being dragged out in the streets and having your head shaven. having mobs come through and beat you